in terms of how we got here. Classic example of herd mentality. I mean, everybody's doing it, so should we? What was the role of the SIs and let's say, even the industry analysts in this?
Culpable. I think if I can answer that in a word. So we had, just a big, suddenly when I kind of went up and got into cloud, 20 some odd years ago, I was CTO of a cloud startup, back in the early 2000s. And everybody was just kind of feeling their way through it. I was, promoting this as a utility model that may have some value. And I think what happened is like 2009, 2010, everything shifted. The definition of cloud computing came out of NIST. I was actually involved in working on that. And then suddenly everybody goes, okay, we got to have this stuff in the cloud. We're going to make this move. This is a smarter way to do it. It's cheaper, better, more scalable, more secure. So everything needs to move to the cloud. And so lots of companies declared, we're shutting our data centers down in 2 years and we're moving.
This is Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, a podcast for IT leaders and implementers looking to reliably scale database ops while maintaining control of their data stack. In each episode, we join industry experts to discuss the what and why of sovereignty and how you can implement the Sovereign DBaaS concept of your own using open source databases, deployment models, and tooling. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to 2025's fourth episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded. I'm Vinay Joosery, and this episode is brought to you by Several Nines. So today we'll talk about the evolution of enterprise cloud strategy, from aggressive public cloud adoption to the growing trend of cloud repatriation. To help us unpack the topic, today's guest, David Linthicum. David has over 30 years in enterprise technology and is globally recognized thought leader, innovator, and influencer in cloud computing, AI, and cybersecurity. He's the author of over 17 best-selling books, over 7,000 articles. That's an impressive number. And over 50 courses on LinkedIn Learning. So now I'm really excited to have David with us today. We tried to connect a couple of years ago when you were just finishing your tenure as Deloitte's Chief Cloud Strategy Officer, and the timing was not quite right. So thanks for joining us, David. Where does this podcast find you today?
It's great to be here. I'm in Loudoun County, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C.
Excellent. And what are you up to these days?
Doing the independent influencer thing right now. I retired from Deloitte last year as the Chief Cloud Strategy Officer for many years. Had a blast doing that job. That was a lot of fun, but obviously limited in what I could post and produce. So started a YouTube channel called The Cloud Insider, the same name of the book. It's doing really well. I think I'm up to 180,000 subscribers and it's growing quickly. And then doing the independent influencer thing, doing some consulting and lots of project mentoring. So there's lots of agentic AI, generative AI architectures and projects that are underway. And I'm doing, probably a half a dozen mentoring contracts with different, Global 2000 companies that just need some assistance and going through and learning the ropes with their first time through an AI architecture. Still doing cloud architecture, still doing cloud punditry. I still have the InfoWorld blog. Still doing LinkedIn Learning courses. Love doing that. Have a fully mentored course out on Go Cloud Careers. So I think I'm up to 7 jobs again. So just kind of getting things back. Probably worst retirement ever is the best way to describe it.
Okay. All right. Well, you're keeping busy. So in this episode, we'll examine the burgeoning cloud repatriation movement in the light of the cloud journey lifecycle, which I think is a term you coined, David. So we'll take a deeper look into those, into the decisions, the false assumptions, the miscalculations that led to today. We'll talk about the costs of the headlong rush into the cloud, how enterprises are rebalancing their cloud portfolios, and what the contours are of today's hybrid landscape. And finally, how CIOs and other decision makers can avoid the same mistakes in the future. But first, let me ask you, the repatriation zeitgeist seems to be now in full flower, right, so to say. Is it safe to say that the pendulum has swung from the public cloud to, alternative environments?
Yeah, I hope not. It never swings, right? In other words, it's always an adjustment and a correction in terms of moving too quickly to a platform without understanding the requirements of the applications and the data workloads. And that's what we're living through right now. So I think what is back into vogue is the ability to kind of look at the environments and see what it's costing us to run on a public cloud provider versus what it's going to cost us to run on-prem. And then looking at the attributes of the applications, the predictability of the workloads, security, compliance things, and then figuring out where they need to actually be running. So in other words, there was a mass movement, 10 years ago. I was involved in some of it. I was not a happy camper, warning people this is not a good thing. This industry is not going to be kind to this, in moving mass amounts of applications, thousands of applications into the cloud, typically through lift and shift, and just kind of moving the data. They can move an application to the cloud in about a couple hours, as long as the data sets are reasonably, get it up and running and get it going. And so what we saw was just a huge amount of cost that came from that because they weren't operationally optimized for the cloud platforms that were moved on. And so as I write about in my last book, Cloud Computing Insider, we're paying between 2.5 and 3 times the amount of money we thought we were going to pay for the infrastructure running in the cloud. And so enterprises are kind of hitting the reset button. And I'm counseling them not to make the same mistake in reverse. In other words, pull everything off the cloud and put it back on-prem. But, look at the application attributes in terms of what they are, where they should be running. And certain applications are going to be perfectly fine and probably should be running on cloud providers. Elastic capabilities, the ability to provide kind of an ecosystem on demand, which is the case with AI, things like that. There's a reason, there's a business benefit for doing it. But many of the applications that were just lifted and shifted didn't belong there. And so now they're being corrected, not necessarily moving them back to a corporate data center anymore. They're being moved to colos, managed service providers, what I call second tier, third tier cloud providers, sovereign clouds like Lido, who runs a sovereign cloud in Germany. That seems to be a popular option in some of the German sounds right now. And then specialized cloud environments and, getting to a much more reasonable cost impact based on what they're actually using in the cloud. Many of these applications never were going to use the advanced features. They're not going to be serverless. They're not going to, go all in with the AWS, Microsoft, and Google infrastructure. And so this is about right sizing the cloud, I guess is the best way to put it. There's right shifting I've used that term as well, but it's going to take work. It's nothing where we're just kind of hitting the reset button. I think that's making a mistake in the other way.
Right. With respect to what you mentioned, lift and shift of thousands of applications, what are some of the finer points that no one is talking about, right? In terms of how we got here. Classic example of herd mentality. I mean, everybody's doing it, so should we. What was the role of the SIs and let's say, even the industry analysts in this?
Culpable. I think if I can answer that in a word. So we had, just a big, suddenly when I kind of went up and got into clouds, 20 some odd years ago, I was CTO of a cloud startup, back in the early 2000s. And everybody was just kind of feeling their way through it. I was, promoting this as a utility model that may have some value. And I think what happened is like 2009, 2010, everything shifted. The definition of cloud computing came out of NIST. I was actually involved in working on that. And then suddenly everybody goes, okay, we got to have this stuff in the cloud. We're going to make this move. This is a smarter way to do it. It's cheaper, better, more scalable, more secure. So everything needs to move to the cloud. And so lots of companies declared, we're shutting our data centers down in 2 years and we're moving everything to AWS, everything to Microsoft or to Google. And that's what happened. And suddenly it came from when I was getting kicked out of the meetings for promoting cloud or promoting the people look at cloud, and they didn't agree with that. Now suddenly people were getting kicked out of the meetings for not promoting cloud. And so obviously the SIs and the consulting firms were all in on that because they're going to make money. And it kind of change occurs. You make money as a consultant. And, I've benefited that personally myself. And so the cloud companies, the SIs, about $2 billion of marketing spending that was going on at the time. Lots of the thought leaders who are now influencers were promoting it as well. And, people were, just kind of made the shift into the cloud because they thought it was the destination everybody was going to. When I'm doing triage on these projects, in other words, when they are doing repatriation, I'm getting called in by boards of directors and they say, go find out why this happened so it doesn't happen again. And that's the reason 9 times out of 10 that they give me. Everybody was moving in that direction. We were told by, the analyst firms, we were told by the consultants, we were told by the vendors themselves that it's the right decision. Everything's going to be cheaper, better, faster. Get out of the data center business. You want to be in that. And for aspects of that were correct, but not the total, reassignment of all these applications into an infrastructure that's going to be cost ineffective. And I think that's what they missed. So they were assuming that the costs were going to be much lower. And you would have to get about 50% cost reduction to make the migration in the cloud a viable option for you. But they found out something different. They weren't optimized for the cloud. So it's very much like running a 1950s refrigerator in your house. It's going to take a whole bunch more power unless you remodernize it and redo it. So unless you take these applications and rebuild them as something that's going to be much more efficient, you're going to find that these things are going to, just be a huge cash suck. And so the enterprises, I think, just had enough of it, a couple of years ago and started to look at other opportunities and not necessarily hitting the hyperscaler button every time they wanted to move something in the cloud, and also taking a lot of those workloads and moving it out of cloud. And that becomes the process of admitting you made a mistake, which is a tough thing to do. Fortunately, many people who make these mistakes at the companies are gone. And so the poor people who are working there now have to deal with the aftermath. And so it's just a correction for doing some things, following the hype. And we're seeing an analog of that today with the AI stuff. In other words, we're moving to AI. In many cases, AI is a perfectly good development model and architecture for building these applications. AI is going to have, some influence on what the application is able to do and bring value back to the business. But many of the times I'm seeing that they don't have a proper business case and use case for AI. So they're just using it because the hype's there. They're doing agentic AI because the hype's there. And they want to be kind of a hero in their company for working on the newer, cooler stuff, and also follow where they think the crowd is going. They think that's the right thing to do for their career and the right thing to do for the company. That's never a good idea. It's never going to be a single architecture framework. It's always has to be the it depends answer everybody hates, but it's the it depends answer that's the right answer.
Right. So we've read about, cloud costs being the top issue for CIOs, right, for several years now. It seems like everyone was saying there's an iceberg ahead, but no one was doing anything, right? When did signals start flashing red for you?
Oh, when they were doing it. Because I was doing the cost models and some of the applications I realized were going to benefit from moving in the cloud, but many of them, probably 80%, a lot of these lift and shift arrangements, they were applications that were going to use resources in such a way where they weren't going to be cost effective. And so I hit the panic button, not the panic button, but, warned everybody, that this could be the outcome here. And they kind of assumed that the cloud costs were going to go down. The cloud providers were going to fix things for them. And even if it's going to cost us more initially, eventually it's going to go down. And I just didn't see that happening because the cloud providers have no motivation for reducing their cost, even though the cost of hardware has come down like an amazing amount in the last 10 years. Cost of storage and SSD storage as well. And so it was, kind of the architecture skeptic in me that started to talk about the fact that we may not be doing this, but no one was listening, at the time. So I remember I was writing for my InfoWorld blog I had for about 15 years. My editor, Eric Knorr, based on some of the skeptical articles I was writing in the blog, and I post there twice a week, and I do to this day. And he said, "Do you like the cloud?" Because they were very, devil's advocate for let's not move here, let's think about this and things like that. But no one else was saying that. And I think that, it was a message that people probably agreed with, but it fell under the radar screen with everything else out there. And so probably 5 years ago is when it's kind of started to emerge that repatriation was actually a thing. I saw some secret projects to move many of the applications that were on the cloud back to the cloud. And typically these were, repeat offenders where they were, just burning way more cash than they thought they would be. And the enterprises wanted to get off that cash extraction train. And then it slowly just kind of built up. And it's kind of a weird market because it's not talked about. With a few exceptions, no one does a press release that tells them that, remember how we moved AWS? Well, we're moving back. Maybe Dropbox and a few companies that are selling technology may do that because it can benefit from it. But they're super secret projects. You sign NDAs when you do them. And you don't talk about them, certainly not to the press. But it's just, and my anecdotal information is I'm probably seeing, growth in the last 3 years of, 120% in terms of enterprises that are working on this. And they're moving to other infrastructures. They're not moving back to an enterprise data center. They're not buying data centers and building data centers. They're using colos and managed service providers, which are fine analogs for doing that kind of stuff. You still get the same value out of that stuff. But it's weird. It's like, yeah, we're doing repatriation. They whisper it at conferences, and I go, okay, well, no one's listening, and it's a good thing. You guys are, able to admit that you have an issue and you have to go fix it. And that's what architects should do. No shame in it, but organizations don't consider it something that's going to reflect positively on them because it looks like they made a mistake and they're fixing it now, which in many cases that's the case. And so it's this weird market where everybody is normalizing their applications and no one's talking about it. And you're also compelled not to talk about it if you're working for them as a consultant, which I respect all the NDAs I sign and confidentiality and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of it going on.
Right. So in terms of, how we measure the cost, I mean, have we fundamentally measured the value of the cloud in the wrong way, say in terms of just cost? Because when we talk about, for example, capital allocation, CapEx versus OpEx. I mean, if you look at Andreessen Horowitz analysis of Dropbox cloud costs, right, weighing on cost of goods sold, effectively it reduced the market value of the enterprises, and that was that was another cost in a way to the enterprise. I mean, apart from that analysis, I haven't seen a lot more on that, let's say, being discussed. It's more like people are saying, well, we are surprised by the cost of the bills coming in.
Well, there's a whole category of skill sets now and practice, which is FinOps for the cloud, which is kind of emerged out of the cost crisis that cloud computing had. So people are putting more metrics and measurements and value measurements around the cost of cloud computing. I've been skeptical with that movement and some of the tooling there because in essence, I don't think they're looking at the right metrics. I made a YouTube video about it and they didn't like it so much, but the FinOps organizations. But the reality is I think they need to tune their stuff and get a little bit better at it, a little bit more realistic in terms of how they're looking at the architectures. So there was not a lot of cost analysis, almost none, that went in to do that, didn't do business cases, didn't figure out. I was doing some back of the napkin stuff where I, realized that this is not going to work out as well as we think it is. But now that cost analysis is back in place. And so if you look at the recent surveys, the CIOs are still focused on cloud aspects of it, but they're going to control the cost in a very disciplined way, at least according to them. We'll see if that actually bears out. In other words, it's going to take a few years before the FinOps systems spin up and we get the cost governance in place and we have the cost accounting, and the AI stuff is helping us tremendously in that and understanding how those things are doing. But then you get into how you're going to define the value. And so people will say, we're moving into cloud because we're going to get huge amounts of value from the agility of it and the ability to have instant scalability and the ability to have instant and auto provisioning. And so we can move as fast as the market moves. And in many cases, they put a huge value on that, but when we look at the enterprises, they don't use it. And a tire plant in Akron is going to say, yeah, we're going to benefit from this agility and the scalability that cloud is able to provide. So we're willing to pay the premium to remain in the cloud, remain in the infrastructure. And they never need agility. They never need scalability. They have a very well-defined, slowly growing business. It organically grows over time, and they don't necessarily need special IT needs. So you can certainly run it in the cloud, but it's going to cost you 3 times, that and running into an analog that's going to run on-prem. So we're getting smarter about it, but I still find a lot of lacking skills in how people are doing the cost analytics, and even in the FinOps world. So the FinOps organizations are supposed to bring lots of discipline to it. I mean, the issue is they're run by consulting firms. Those are a lot of consultants that are in there, and even the vendors are in the middle of it. And so everybody has their own agendas in terms of how they're promoting the stuff. And I'm not sure that the enterprises are benefiting from that movement as much as they should. I think they should benefit from some of the ideas that are coming out of it. But we may again be building false metrics and false value measurements, that's coming out of the cloud stuff, because we're not taking a good critical look at what this stuff means and how these applications are going to exist in a larger ecosystem. People always, judge the cloud applications that are sitting on the cloud. I understand why they're doing it, but the real value determination is your ability to exist in a larger ecosystem. Enterprises are running heterogeneous environments. They have mainframe computers, supercomputers, some of them have quantum-based systems. So how does everything kind of work and play that well together? And how should the value metrics be evaluated based on that? It's a harder question to do. You need a consulting engagement really to get to the right answer, which I do. But many enterprises aren't looking at that right now. They're going to conferences. I just went to IBM Think this week. They're hearing the rah-rah stories. Now it's about AI. It used to be about cloud. And they're not necessarily thinking as critical as they should around how to leverage this technology effectively. And it's always going to be an issue. It's never going to be a perfect world. We're always going to make mistakes. We're not going to look at things with the discipline that we need to look at it. But we're just going to end up repeating the same mistakes and wasting a lot of money. I mean, all that cash that went to the cloud providers could have gone into R&D, could have gone into hiring additional people. It couldn't even given it to charity. It could have gone into, better investments in the company. Instead it was cash that just rolled out of the company that brought no value back into the company based on what is expended. You can't do that too long. You're going to find yourself out of business.
Mm. And actually, this is another interesting point that you mentioned, right? Your cost goes 2.5 to 3x more, right? And that starts eating into your R&D budget. I mean, it eats into everybody's budget, right? So you're supposed to be using the cloud to experiment, to innovate, but then you are spending way too much, right? Even with these static applications, and you're basically cannibalizing, on your innovation budget. Do we know that cost? What is that cost?
It depends on the organization, as to how much that money would have been spent and how much value would have come back to the organization. It's never a good idea to spend money you don't need to spend. It's a business. It's an easy business thing. But as far as how much value you're extracting out of the organization, depends on what industry you're in. I mean, if you're a tire company, you're not going to have a big R&D budget to find better combinations of rubber or whatever like that. And so it's not necessarily going to hurt you as much. You're just going to lose the cash. But if you're a financial organization or a technology organization, healthcare organization, where that research can really lead to the eureka moment, which takes your business to the next level, I think many times you're missing those opportunities because you can't fund those programs. What's kind of funny to me ultimately is that the enterprises don't understand it and don't like the "it depends" answer that comes from it. So they're looking for value metrics or white papers that are written in terms of how you measure the value. It just, for you, it's got to be customized for your particular industry that you're in, your particular business, and it can be very, very different. Huge amount of spectrum there in terms of how much value can come back to the business.
Right. Yeah. And I guess now, I mean, the genie is out of the bottle. It's like, well, okay, I mean, these things costs. Maybe not everybody will admit, but people are kind of moving away. So how are these enterprises rebalancing their cloud portfolios, and how long do you think it's going to take?
Yeah, they're basically evaluating the applications again. So they did a triage before they migrated them into the cloud, didn't do a very good close look at the applications, but that was part of the migration factories that the consulting firms would set up. Now they're looking at them for what aspects they are. So they are hiring people, not necessarily to change them, but to assess them in terms of how inefficient they are. And it's very easy to do with some of the AI tools we have today. We can look in the code, we look in the data, look at the access IO, IO optimization, the capability of the application, efficiency of the application, how much power it burns. All that stuff is available to you via these tools, which is cool. They weren't around when we were migrating them into the cloud. At least they weren't as powerful. So that's occurring. And so you are seeing these assessments of all of these workloads and these data sets to see, what they're doing, how they're profiling, and if they can benefit from migration to the cloud or away from the cloud. And so we're looking at alternative platforms. This is nothing more than a normalization of workloads on the on the cloud in terms of understanding what they are and where they should exist, and reevaluating that and asking the question, should this be on a sovereign cloud if this thing only runs in Germany? And that's where we have to keep the data sets. And we have a big compliance issue, which means we have to maintain better control over it and auditability and things like that. Should this run on a private cloud infrastructure? Private clouds back in 2013, when the public cloud folks were exploding, was not a good alternative from the public cloud providers. They were awful. They were engineering projects to get those things going. OpenStack was a tough thing to do. Not that way anymore. VMware, HPE, all have private cloud options that are excellent. You can set them up pretty quick. And so looking at those opportunities and just kind of reevaluating, where these things should run. And also it's never moving back to another platform. In other words, we're not moving everything back to the one single managed service provider, one colo provider. We're moving these applications to any number of systems where they're going to be best optimized and best able to run. And it's going to be something that's a fairly easy process to work. It's just a lot of work to get it done. And you asked the question about time frame. I think it's going to be 10 years. I really do. I know people are saying what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years. It never happens in 3 to 5 years. It took 15 years to migrate 40% of the workloads into the cloud, removing the SaaS stuff. And it's going to take another 10 years to start migrating them to the other specialized platforms. And so that's going to be the case. It's funny, I was remembering in an anecdote, it's kind of a funny thing. People, the vendors are complaining to me because the enterprises aren't moving as fast as they think they should move into AI, and they want to sell more AI services and things like that, definitely the cloud providers. And the number one reason that enterprises are saying why they can't afford to move applications into AI is their cloud costs are too high. So in other words, the cloud providers are taking away the money that they want used to move their systems into AI. So they're biting off, nose to spite their face in, many instances. And I'm like, do you guys know that? Talk to your enterprises. They can't move to AI because your costs are too high. In other words, you're taking too much cash out of them. They don't have the budget to do it. And the poor CIOs, now they're getting the board of directors that are, coming down and having a lot of pressure on them. Move to generative AI. It's going to be core, competitive advantage that we can make in there. They can't afford it because they moved all their applications into the cloud. That cost 3 times as much as they thought it was going to cost. And now they're stuck. And unless you give them more money, they're not going to be able to migrate. They're not going to be able to, take any, build the AI systems you're looking to bake. And these AI systems are going to be 5 times the cost of traditional systems. And the data and the processing and all specialized GPUs, TPU kind of stuff that's very expensive. So we're in this kind of stagnant, area these days where I think the cloud providers are their own worst enemy as far as them moving into the cloud. I mean, AWS just missed their numbers. All 3 of them missed their numbers last quarter. We're going to see some weaknesses in the acceleration in that space. I think they're going to benefit from AI, but they don't have good reputations in the enterprises right now. They view them very much like the big enterprise software providers, back in the 80s and 90s, as something that's, a net negative for their enterprise and a net negative for their IT infrastructure, which is never where they wanted to be. But that's what the cloud providers are.
Yep. Yeah. So you mentioned 10 years. Now, let me ask you this. Geopolitically, there's been lots happening in these last, 110 days or so. Right? So the US is at odds with pretty much the whole world right now, right? Will we see a boost in repatriation? I mean, as an example, in Europe, there is growing unease, right, over the dominance of the top, first, second, third, hyperscalers, which are all US, right? And it's been there for several years, this kind of unease. But perhaps now the EU will do something, for example, right? There's a movement called Eurostack to build a European and like an independent European technology stack. What's your thoughts on that? Will it accelerate that movement?
Yeah, right now, and I just did a video on this, is posting in a couple of weeks on my Insider channel. The Europeans are moving away from cloud about 2, sometimes 3 times as fast as the US-based companies. And so if you look at the surveys, I don't see them as much because they're not my clients, but they're doing so for a variety of reasons that are normal, that are related to what the United States' companies are moving away from, and some that are kind of unique to them. They don't trust the providers as to protecting their data. They view their data exposed to U.S. law enforcement as far as breaches and things go. And how would you like to, be a European country? You don't have a presence in the U.S. and suddenly a U.S.-based cloud provider that you're using announced that the feds showed up with a warrant and took your servers with your data on it. Possibly that could happen, or they could get kicked off the clouds and things like that. So the skeptical nature of them, they've always been very skeptical. Didn't like the Google, camera cars running down the street and things like that. It is kind of coming out, and it's very nationalist, which is fine. And they're looking to kind of turn inward into getting their own cloud infrastructure. And so we saw the rise of companies like Lidl, which is a grocery store that decided to build a public cloud provider only for Germany. I think they're a sovereign cloud. They only work in that country, very small compared to the big hyperscalers, but they're having an impact that provide good alternatives. And basically, these applications only need processing, memory, CPU, storage, very basic services. They don't need the, 60,000 services with one announced every week that's coming out of AWS, Microsoft, and Google. They just know there's something that elaborate because you're paying for that stuff, even though you're not using it. So that skeptical nature, and some of it's kind of based on paranoia when I talk to them, but some of it is based on reality. In other words, they are looking at the risk of, breaches occurring. They don't want their data controlled by the American-based companies because they are concerned about something occurring with geopolitical things. And I'm not a political dude, but I can kind of see how things could go south for you, and suddenly you're caught holding the short end of the stick. Very much like tariffs now. Some companies are going to benefit from it, some companies are not. And anytime the government changes policies and certainly compliance, there's going to be a shift in how that impacts some of these businesses out there. And so the Europeans see it coming. They have special compliance that's way more strict than the US-based systems they have to adhere to. And so they're being more conservative in making these decisions. And in many instances, they're moving off of the American-based cloud providers. They're moving to other cloud providers like Lidl and things like that. But they're definitely moving off of the major hyperscalers because they don't trust them. And I hear that over and over again. I thought it was paranoia, the first 5 times I heard it. Now I see some of the analysis coming out of the countries by some of the people who follow the European, cloud engagements. And there's some reality there. In other words, there's going to be some risk if you're putting your data and putting your workloads on some cloud-based system that's actually controlled by something that sits in another country, which means they're under governance of that country.
Right. And then as you mentioned, this is about optimization, not abandonment, right? So the companies they're finding a new equilibrium between cloud and on-prem. So as part of moving off from the US hyperscalers, they could put it on-prem or somewhere else, or sort of local cloud, maybe better cost structure, and maybe it seems like it's a bit of a get out of jail card now. It's like, okay, for at least for the companies that feel affected by these geopolitical issues. Right? They can just say, "Hey, yeah, we gotta get out." So, So, can you conceptualize the hybrid landscape?
Yeah, I think it's a term that's overblown because everybody's going to have a hybrid infrastructure if they're using a public cloud provider. They obviously have some on-prem, even if it's just office automation servers that are working that are there. So it's always provided us with the best degree of options. There was never going to be 100% movement into the public cloud providers. People were saying that. That's not going to happen. And there's never going to be 100% movement back to the on-prem system. So we're always going to have a mix between cloud providers, typically multiple clouds, and now with the new sovereign clouds and the specialized clouds and the second tier clouds, some companies are having a dozen clouds, and you deal with the SaaS providers, Salesforce and all those ServiceNow and all those types of ilk, and you're getting into hundreds of things that you're managing where your infrastructure is sitting off-prem in the hands of a SaaS provider or a cloud provider. So we're definitely in that world. But obviously, the prem infrastructure should be some sort of an architectural option where we have engaged in owning platforms. We know where they are. We have access to them. We're able to expand them. We're able to expand the storage systems and the compute systems to run workloads that are going to be more apt for running things on-prem. And I always encourage people for maintaining that infrastructure because it's always great when you're an architect to have options. And sometimes the options are going to be very limited to what's currently in-house and what skills are currently there. And so it's much more advantageous for them to have skills in dealing with on-prem systems, even mainframe-based systems. And so, people are concerned about, I got to skill up and get my enterprise, my data center people back. No, you don't. You partner with colo providers, managed service providers. All that stuff is outsourced now. You don't even see the hardware. If you can engage with a colo provider, they'll find you a contractor to set up the cage and the colo and bring in the servers, screw them in, power them up, and just throw you the IP address, and you have never even to travel there. So in essence, you're getting a cloud where things are provisioned with people and manual stuff. And so all of that infrastructure should be in place for BCDR. In other words, we have to be able to look at, hitting the reset button if something occurs in the cloud. We could have some cloud outages that are devastating, and your ability to have backup systems that are running on some other platform or even some other cloud are going to be a necessity, I think, for many of these organizations. And again, the best thing for an architect is you having options. And when I think the fallacy, people have a notion of architects who show up, to a project and they go, okay, you can use any technology you want to solve the issue. That's almost never the case. It's going to be, we have an on-prem infrastructure. We're using traditional LAMP stacks, Linux, and, that's what's currently running. Those are the skills in-house that are maintaining those systems. And we use AWS because we have an agreement with them that goes on for the next few years where we pre-bought, $3 million worth of credits. I don't know if they actually do that, but I'm just using that for this scenario. So you're going to be limited by what they allow you to use. And so I always tell my architecture students, you're not the decider. So you're going to put these limitations around you because some sort of a business engagement that coexists, and you can't fight it. You have to build an architecture in that kind of array. And so you're going to be much better off if you have on-prem options where you're able to leverage commoditized hardware, because especially with these AI systems that people are looking to build, I mean, I can't, you think running applications in the cloud was expensive over the last 10 years. Running AI applications is going to be, 10 times the cost of what we could do in replicating these environments on-prem. And also, getting away with using traditional CPUs versus GPUs, and your ability to optimize those environments much better because you have a better control over them. And also the cloud providers aren't optimized for AI as much as people think they are. So they're going to be inefficient running on there as well. So it's options. And I don't think you have to open up too many options, but I do think you have to have skill sets in-house that deal with the on-prem, and you can always allocate more money into the cloud if needed, and allocate more money into the on-prem skills and those operations if needed. So the choices, the options, the ability to fail back, that's going to make a hybrid cloud, way more attractive.
Good. What are your thoughts about the private cloud tech stack, right? Then VMware, Broadcom, Tanix. You worked with OpenStack before. There's other ones like CloudStack.
Yeah, CloudStack, OpenStack were the big ones that we were dealing with, like back in 2013. Believe it or not, much better than they were. And used to be the private clouds were never a good option. And I ran into this a ton where they go, I don't want to move in the public cloud, but I want a cloud. So guess what? I'm going to go with an OpenStack cloud. And here's an OpenStack code tree. Go set it up on our private servers. And it was an engineering project. It was probably the most complicated mess of stuff I ever went through in my entire life. Not to, take anything on OpenStack and, as an open source project, those things always work out that way in the initial infancy. Now they're better. The OpenStack stuff is fine. If you want to use it, it's fairly turnkey to install, and it's in its 7th, 8th generation. So it's been hammered in and in much better quality than it was 10 years ago. The private cloud providers who are commercially focused, the Broadcoms, the HPEs, Nutanix, things like that, hyper-converged systems, also have great private cloud providers. In other words, very turnkey, very easy to install. They're obviously not as easy as setting up a public cloud provider, virtual ecosystem, but they provide an AI ecosystem on demand. They provide application dev test stuff on demand, DevOps tool chains on demand. You can configure it however you want it. Most of the software providers and tool vendors run on those platforms and support those platforms. So the options are there. And so in other words, if I'm trying to get the benefits of using a public cloud provider, in other words, the easy button for lots of different things, and that's why people use public cloud providers mostly, you're going to see that in the private cloud options, and they're going to be much cheaper because you're paying for the hardware and you're owning the software. You may pay a license fee, but it's definitely not going to be a cloud service where you're getting a bill every month for how much CPU you're utilizing, memory, I/O, and network bandwidth, ingress, egress fees. Those things are terrible. And it's going to be, I think, a better option for many enterprises, and certainly for the AI stuff. I just kind of see that in looking at the cost efficiencies of running it in a public cloud provider, the hyperscalers, the big three. versus the other options out there. That's going to be a much better option. Also, specialized cloud providers like, CoreWeave and Lambda Labs that provide GPU as a service, they're much less expensive than going with the major cloud providers. They have to be. So these are purpose-built clouds out there, these private clouds that are just going to be much more cost-effective options for many of these workloads that are out there. And they're going to be much more easier to maintain, configure, set up, architect, build systems on than they were 10 years ago. Like I said, they were a nightmare. That's something I almost had PTSD from those days.
Mentioning about, GPU as a service, NVIDIA has this neat operator, the NVIDIA operator, which basically allows people to, easily slice and dice these GPUs and just serve them. So I guess, that's they make it really easy to become pretty much a cloud provider if you can buy the hardware, Kubernetes on top of it, and
I think I could become a cloud, set up a cloud ecosystem, including multi-tenancy, in about 5 days. Ready, even putting the billing system on top of it, which means internal billing, chargeback, showback, things like that. Just because there's so much out there now, you just configure it and integrate the systems, where it was a huge engineering project. Back in the 2000s, I was, taking software and turning it into multi-tenant SaaS providers. That was a consulting firm I had called Blue Mountain Labs that did that. That was a major project in making those things happen. And looking at the same sort of configuration now, it would take a very short amount of time because the automation and the technologies and the tool sets that are around setting those things up. And you can even use some of the stuff that's on demand. So in other words, it's in the cloud, you build your cloud and you run it on-prem, which is, kind of a weird way to do it, but that kind of stuff exists.
Right. So am I right to say that a lot of talk is around compute storage layer, but maybe not stateful and the operations? DB as a whole, but it's come these days, but I don't know. That's my impression that, like OpenStack had this database as a service project. Now the name has escaped me. I can't remember the name now. But yeah, they had an open source project, but nobody uses that. And, the people who worked on it X years ago, just, they're gone. What's your thought on that? Stateful layer.
Yeah, obviously the, raw storage is going to be, what supports the databases. And that's where, much of the work needs to be done. The biggest impediment enterprises are finding to move to AI, other than the cost, is going to be the state of their data. In other words, the state of anything they hold in some sort of a stateful way in their infrastructure is not necessarily going to be in the best shape. And so the ability to kind of think through that and re-engineer that, and the ability to find different analogs is going to be important. For example, if lots of people move to DynamoDB on AWS when they moved into the cloud, DynamoDB doesn't run anywhere but AWS. So you're going to have to find some sort of an object-based analog that's going to run on-prem. And so the data strategy should be a complete systemic thread through this entire journey that we're on right now. So we need to figure out the current as-is data structure, how much under-optimization is there, how much data hygiene is going to be needed, the ability to clean the data up, organize the data up, have a common metadata layer that runs across these various infrastructures. And you got to fix that before you get into the AI stuff. We're just going to have garbage AI systems if we try to train them with the corporate data that's out there now. And so the fixing of that stuff is going to be probably the hardest piece of this to do. In other words, I can optimize an application, just change the code, use these code scanners, figure out what needs to change, even use AI to make the changes. But the data is in its state. And so I can use tools to figure out how bad things are. But at the end of the day, that's something that has to be fixed. And I have to have some sort of a strategy around it. Where are we going? What kind of data systems are we using? What are opportunities to combine and simplify? The data complexity thing is always going to be a problem. And that people need to start thinking about that, differently. So there's a reason we have data scientists and DBAs, and they're paid very well, because most people's data is a large mess. When I go, speak to clients, the question I always say is, do we have a single version of a customer here in data? They never do. There's another single source of truth of the system. All their data is out of sync, inaccurate, unhygienic. And we have to figure out how to fix that as we make these moves. And I think that, it's a hard problem to solve, but it's part of the architectural journeys. In other words, there has to be data, there has to be security, has to be governance, has to be infrastructure optimization, storage optimization, and utilization of anything that's going to be stateful that's part of those systems. And your ability to not just figure out how you're going to store stuff in a database, but, how you're going to maintain state amongst these various distributed systems that, by the way, are running on different platforms, because that's what we're proposing. We're saying we're going to get off the cloud where everything's going to be a little simpler because we're dealing with a single multi-tenant infrastructure, moving it into a very heterogeneous infrastructure with heterogeneous data storage. And it can be done. And it's a good idea to figure out how it's being done. You're heading there, by the way. So, and don't cry about the data complexity stuff, because that's a problem you're going to have to solve no matter what. So put some sort of infrastructure in place, put some sort of thinking in place. And the big thing, put a strategy in place as to where you're going to do it. That's the most often thing that I will talk to architects and enterprise architects and CTOs of these big global 2000 companies. What's your data strategy? And, they look at you confused. What do you mean? I mean, where you're taking the stuff, the data, where's the data going to be stored, how it's going to be maintained, how it's going to be managed. So you have a holistic, they can always tell me what it's going to be in a particular domain, a particular application. But when you look at the enterprise as a whole, where are you taking this? Because that becomes kind of the crown jewels, the asset for the company. And it's what's going to be making some of these AI systems more valuable. It's going to be dependent on the quality of data and the availability of data in these systems, integration of the data assets, the enterprise application integration, reeling its ugly head again, that we haven't seemed to solve that yet. So it becomes another thing that we have to think about as architects, and it needs to rise up in the level of importance. I think people think that data is your ability to store, states is not as important as it is. And I think that's something as an architects, we have to, keep bringing it up. Even when I teach the architect class, I get, blank looks when I start talking about that, because they don't hear it out there in the hype. You never see articles that are written about that as much anymore. It's not brought up as an issue that's so limiting, when many of the enterprises, like I said, besides the cost, their data's crud, and they're going to have to refix the data, and they're looking at, a 5-year period and, $500 million to get that done. And that'd be the single most toughest obstacle to get over the system. Repatriating, not a problem. But if we're going to leverage these AI systems, we have to get the data in a state that's going to make it useful. And I just don't see it there now. It's a mess.
Yeah. Switching to another kind of a bit, different angle. You mentioned in an article that, repatriation is a refinement, not a revolution, right? So what does this movement mean for the public cloud business model? Like, will we see a world where maybe, hyperscalers will not play as big a role as they do today?
Yeah, I think so. They're not necessarily going to be replaced, but you see, I think their influence is slowing down a bit, and their market penetration is slowing down a bit. And that's not necessarily because I think their business is slowing down as much, but the other businesses around them that are competing with them, that are going after the same customers, are accelerating. So the CoreWeaves, the Lambda Labs, the Lido, the sovereign clouds, and there's hundreds of them all over the world. Private cloud providers, and really what I call the alt cloud alternatives, are becoming where people are focused on right now. I mean, the most listened to and watched videos and read blogs that I have right now, and when I talk about that, I talk about, looking at some of these alternatives, the fact we're going to move into a heterogeneous, very complex environment. We have to prepare for that and figure out how to manage those things. Multi-cloud is going to be everything. You're never going to be able to use a single cloud provider. And the role of the AWS's, Microsoft, and Google, and probably Oracle a bit as well, and Ali Cloud for the Asian market will diminish over time. And so I don't think the press will pay as much attention to them. Right now, they're kind of looked as legacy technology, believe it or not, because it's, 15 years old. Systems have been out there for a long period of time. They look like very mature. It's a mature technology stack at the end of the day. They do a lot of things well, operate those things well. And it's just going to be an asset that's going to be an option. And it's not necessarily the preferred option unless the prices go down. Now, what they could do is, well, they can't collaborate on prices because that's illegal, but decide to start cutting their prices tremendously to compete with the alt cloud environments. And I just did a video on that this week, talking about why the costs are so high. And the reality is they're not willing to reduce the cost because it's going to diminish their EPS. I'm making these assumptions. They're publicly traded companies. I wasn't at the board meeting, so I don't know exactly what happened. But but in doing so, they're going to protect the value in the market. So, companies are companies. They're there to maximize shareholder equity. And if they don't see a crisis, they're not going to drop the prices. It's going to reduce the earnings per share, which is how they're going to be measured. So I suspect that they may have a price drift down over time as everything else becomes incredibly cheap. But they're going to hold fast on what they're able to do. They're trying to get the investment back on all the R&D that went into building the serverless stuff and their databases and, onboarding the open source stuff and managing the partner ecosystem and everything that they do really well. And they're just going to find that many people aren't going to pay for that service if they're not going to use it. You got to remember, if you're paying for the cloud provider, you're paying for all the R&D that went into all the services that you use, but most of them that you don't. And so many enterprises never use serverless, never use, object-based databases that are native to a cloud provider, never use the middleware systems, streaming systems, things like that. But you're still paying for it. They just use storage, compute, and that's it. And they go with AWS because it was the brand that was recommended at the time. So it's not necessarily going to be needed. So I do see some slowing down in interest in net new systems that go into AWS. And I think the others will rise around them. So the rising tide will raise all boats. I think the AI is rising the tide right now. I just don't think the hyperscalers boats are going to rise as fast in the marketplace. And they're going to have to respond to that and figure it out. And figure out they live in an ecosystem of lots of different things. These cloud providers have had the attitude, everything needs to exist on our walled garden. And if you suggested anything else, they were almost hostile about it. And now I think they should realize that's not the case. They're going to have to exist in a larger ecosystem. They have to figure out how to work and play well with these environments. And there's a way to find a path to profitability within that, but not on the current path.
Right. And then it means the enterprises need to be smart in the way they actually, navigate that landscape. But
AWS is not the default solution anymore. It used to be you never got fired for buying IBM, and it was never you got fired for using AWS, and now that's not the case.
Yeah. So thinking about, you mentioned earlier, we are seeing the same story repeat itself again with AI, right? So how can organizations navigate hype cycles better in the future, right? I mean, do the incentives mean that it will happen again? Or, you would expect people would have learned, right? So, but there's always these hype cycles that come with something new. And then, there's a herd mentality, people go all in, and then there's a lot of disappointment. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, it's always viewed as least risky to follow the crowd. In other words, if you're making a decision with tens of thousands of other companies, you're probably making the right decision according for the crowd wisdom of the crowds, so to speak. And so that's becoming a bit out of vogue as it was. And so there are some skeptics who are looking at this stuff. But the cultures in these organizations has probably gotten more susceptible to making these mistakes because they don't seem to have the skills that they had 20 years ago and 10 years ago. And I think that's because we're producing fewer people, out of colleges that are going to be, veterans in looking at this technology. People are getting particular certifications and vendors. So they're AWS certified, they're Microsoft certified, things like that. So they come along with those biases that are built into them. And so we're probably going to end up making the mistakes now because of the whole thing. We're just going to follow where everybody else is going. And I think that's perfectly acceptable to companies that they're just going to, look at what everybody else is moving and follow and make it happen. And there's no pushback on that I'm hearing. So when I'm bringing this stuff up, what's amazing to me is not that you and I are talking about this topic and we kind of get it, but they don't understand why we're concerned about that. Why is an architect, why, if we're going to make, if we're moving it into AWS, what do you care? Well, you could end up running an infrastructure that's going to run very much like you did in your past. Remember, 3 weeks ago, we just moved your 50 applications out of AWS and back on-prem. That you're going to end up making a mistake that you're going to regret and have to hit the reset button. And that's going to be very expensive. And by the way, if you're considering AI is going to be the most important application infrastructure you ever build, and it's going to define your business, in many cases, that's the case. It's going to be an innovative differentiator and build the business. Then you can't mess around with where you're going to platform that thing. And so you have to think carefully about what are the most cost-effective way to do it, because the more cash you put into the platform, the less you can put into R&D and some of the other things you need to build within these environments. And so there's lots of cash out there, and the vendors are pushing the cash at the SIs and pushing the cash at the enterprises. And so the SIs are incentivized to sell their technology. I always cringe at those kind of partnerships, but they exist. Every one of them does it. And then the enterprises are getting incentives as well, where they're meeting with the CEO and the board of directors and they say, hey, we'll give you $50 million if you build your AI assets in our system. And that sounds like a good deal to them until they get into year 5 and they realize we just spent $3 billion on infrastructure that we didn't need. So all those things are back in play that I saw in the cloud, and many of the same patterns are starting to emerge. And I noticed that there seems to be not necessarily a hunger to understand how not to make those mistakes again. And maybe I'm overly sensitive about it. I've been called, say, Dave, you're naive. But there was no repercussions for people who made those decisions, those bad decisions. People made awful decisions, and they're still there. Still the CIOs, still the CTOs, and they haven't changed their tunes. And so if they're not going to get fired, they're going to get a bonus, for making awful decisions that could kill the company. They're going to keep doing it. And so organizations need to be very skeptical about these decisions. And my dance card is full right now and just getting on Zoom calls every day, discussing this with boards of directors and CEOs and CTOs and things like that. They understand it's a problem. They kind of feel there's nothing they can do about it because they have a political infrastructure in place that's already gone, and then they have no control over that. They're not the deciders, as I mentioned earlier. So they're going to watch the slow motion train wreck again. It's not going to kill every business, but it is going to change the structure in terms of how we're leveraging technology, because so many businesses are going to make the mistake and other businesses are going to be successful with it. And there's going to be new businesses, that are around for the last 10 years. They're going to emerge in a space and disrupt the space and take it over, because the big guys out there seem to be making the same dumb mistakes. Generally speaking, it's not everybody, but I think we're on a course of repeating history right now. I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago, but just in the data that I'm looking at and people I'm communicating with, that seems to be the case.
Wow. So do you have a gold standard example for how the right way to do things should be, right? So who figured it out sooner? Was there a better way to leverage the cloud as an operating model, so to speak?
Yeah, probably Target and Pinterest would be, and I always like the retail case studies because everybody knows who they are, and would be examples of that. And of course, there are people who are able to expose their path. In other words, Geico did it as well. And there's obviously some kind of incentive for them to do it. You don't have them telling the story for nothing. They're telling the story because they got discounts on technology or they're partnering with somebody. But that would be, probably the gold standard of people who leverage repatriation as far as dealing with it from a strategic position and getting themselves in a stronger position. And that would be my standard. It's not getting into a completely 100% optimized technology. Most corporations are going to find that, but just kind of the ability to fix and course correct, mistakes they made in the past. And, those are gold standards. Capital One did it, and I was, they were, the poster child of moving to AWS, back in the early days. They were the ones that, first people who spoke at reInvent. Now they've made some corrections, which means they admitted a problem and fixed some stuff. 3M, Home Depot. They're starting to build up the number of people who are willing to expose their successes. But like I said, when you see one, you're missing about 900. That's kind of the way it works right now. And the other ones are not going to put a press release out or write a paper, and they may even work with partnerships. What's happening now is these people who are exposing their success and with some of the repatriation stuff, again, they have a financial incentive. Yeah, I did notice Geico, kick the cloud out, but we're working with an on-prem infrastructure provider, one that I hadn't heard a lot about, and obviously they were motivated by some of the benefits they were getting from that provider. And then part of the deal was you have to expose your case study. And so there is sort of those things that go on in the past that kind of you have to kind of take a lot of this stuff with a grain of salt. Dropbox is obviously the famous one, but I don't kind of view that as a typical enterprise. I mean, they had a storage service and they were using AWS, and they were able to use a raw storage system on on-prem infrastructure or managed service provider infrastructure, with some AWS is still in the loop. So they're a hybrid environment that are working now. I think that's an example of a technology company moving in that direction. So they're starting to build up. But everybody's going to be completely different. I mean, obviously 36 Signals with Dave Hansen was the big one, a couple of years ago, where he was able to move like a 50 million, he's a small tool developing company, but he was able to move like $100 million of infrastructure and get it down to 10. And he wrote about it and, moving out of the cloud and things like that. He's probably a bit of an outlier because incredibly smart people that know how to do it, and we're able to solve the problem fairly quickly. Enterprises are not necessarily going to have access to those kinds of resources and the ability to turn on a dime and a specialized use case for it. But, if I'm going to list them, those are the lists, with the retailers, who are making the biggest, some of the biggest changes now because they're the cheapest. They're the most frugal companies that I'm dealing with right now because their margins are so low. So when they make a change, everything is to reduce cost, and they will do reduce cost at all costs.
Right. So let me ask you a final question. You're a CIO, you invested in public cloud, you increased your cost significantly, right? Shrinking the budget for innovation. What's your advice?
My advice is take a critical look at what you're doing and do some strategic planning. And I'm not talking about getting all your executives off on an offsite. I'm talking about getting your technology executives and getting some outside assistance. And I attend these meetings all the time where you're getting different opinions on what should be doing. And you're doing so with a study and a complete understanding as to where we are. In many instances, we have these meetings, like I can't tell what to tell them because they haven't told me anything about their existing infrastructure and mistakes they made and things like that. So do a very detailed assessment, consultants, whatever. I think it should be an outsider who does that because it's important that someone takes a critical look at it. And obviously, if people are evaluating their own stuff, everything is going to come up stellar. And then take that assessment into a team of individuals outside and inside the company to make core strategic decisions as to where they should be going. And everybody has to agree upon it. In other words, you have one of these meetings, and I used to have them when I was a CEO. We go into a room and I said, we're not going out of here until we agree on a strategy. We all have to sign off on it. And even if you disagree, you need to tell me why you disagree. We'll discuss it, but we're going to end up with a common way that we're doing because we have to move. We have to start to execute, and we can't execute without a plan. And we're not going to do this little, project-based iteration stuff, try to get to some strategic direction. We're going to look at a 5-year, 10-year plan as to what we're going to do, what we're going to be, the infrastructure we're going to use. It doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes and have to go back and fix something, but that's what needs to happen. And I think that's where the unwillingness comes in. U.S. companies specifically, and I've been an officer of a couple of public companies as a CTO. They think in terms of quarter-on-quarter growth, and that's all they think. So they don't think outside the quarter or even outside the year. And so it's getting them to think about that. So it's not these little micro projects that are going to lead to some sort of strategic value. It's looking at the value of a strategy moving forward. Some companies do it. They do it pretty well. No company does it 100% well. Most companies don't do it at all. They don't have a strategy. And when they do, it's like a catchphrase or something, like we're going to provide the best tires in the world and the best customer service. Okay, thank you. How are you going to do it? What systems are going to be there to make it happen? What kind of platforms are you going to run? So the details matter. And I think that's where people are having a hard time figuring out how to get done.
Right. Okay, time to wrap up. Well, David, thanks for the discussion. Amazing. We talked about there being way more repatriation happening than we'll ever hear, partly because maybe those who made the decisions do not want to lose face. Although repatriation is not sort of a revolution, but just a refinement of a healthy cloud portfolio, right? So in the current climate, where the US is at odds with its allies, Europe, Canada, and many others, right? There is a growing unease over the over-reliance on US hyperscalers. So this might speed up maybe the rebalancing of this portfolio, right? Especially in these countries. So for those who want to hear more from David, please visit davidlinthicum.com or his YouTube channel, Cloud Computing Insider, to stay informed about everything cloud AI, right? So thanks, Dave. Thank you for joining us. That's it for today.
Thank you.